Welcome back to Cultivate Talk. Today's episode takes us into the intersection of media, rhetoric, and politics, and how communication shapes not just what we think, but how we relate to public figures and public life. I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Cole and Dr. Thomas Salek, who are currently collaborating on a book project examining the political rhetoric of Orson Welles, specifically his mid-1940s radio program, the Orson Welles Commentaries. These weekly broadcasts offered Welles a platform to speak directly to the American public on issues ranging from politics to social justice, using a style that was at once intimate, persuasive, and often provocative. In this episode, we explore the unique relationship Welles built with his audience through radio, how his celebrity both amplified and constrained his political voice, and what his rhetorical approach can teach us about today's media landscape. We also draw connections between Welles and later public figures like Ronald Reagan, Jesse Ventura, and Donald Trump, asking what's changed about the relationship between entertainment, influence, and political power. If you've ever thought about how media personalities shape public discourse, or how platforms like podcasts echo earlier forms of communication, this episode offers a fascinating lens into both the past and present. Let's get into it. Dr. Andrew Cole earned his MA and PhD in communication from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research and teaching focus is on communication, media, and technology. Dr. Tom Salek has a PhD in rhetoric and public culture from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research focuses on rhetorical leadership and political communication. Thank you both so much for being here today. How are you guys doing?
Great, thank you.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. I am super excited to have you guys here. Like I just told you a few minutes ago, this is my first time interviewing two folks at the same time, and so I think it's actually super cool. But to kind of start us off, could you both share what first drew you to study Orson Welles and specifically the period of his political radio commentaries in the mid-1940s?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can take that one. So the project that we're working on actually began officially in 2009 when I was at New York University, mainly doing like media studies type of work. And I took a graduate seminar in Orson Welles and at the time was really interested in like Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, and their sort of political commentary, and then stumbled across this series of radio broadcasts, wrote a seminar paper about it, and literally just left it sitting on my computer for probably 10 years. And then I think it was during COVID that I was talking to Andy and we were thinking about like what sort of project did we want to collaborate on next. And I was just like, hey, I've got this thing on Orson Welles. I'm not sure what it is. Sent it his way. And since then, we've sort of been kicking it back and forth. I'm trying to figure out like, well, what does this have to do with the current political climate we're in now? Since obviously by 2020 we had Donald Trump rising to the presidency. We had other instances of celebrities becoming politicians. That was sort of when podcasting itself started to really kick off and become even more popular, especially in the political sphere. And so with it, it was sort of one of those, well, let's dig in deeper and see if there's something going on here. And initially, we just sort of went back and forth. And I think we're thinking about relating it to sort of his broadcasts on atomic bombs and nuclear energy, but then eventually it led to a paper that I submitted at the Rhetorical Society of America 2 years ago that was specifically about the Woodard broadcasts. And then since then, we've been kind of kicking it back and forth about that. And so with it, I mean, initially it was, hey, this is a class paper, but also something that, I found Welles fascinating from just a personal standpoint as a filmmaker, as an entertainer, and all that stuff.
Absolutely. Do you have
Yeah,
any?
I mean, I would say as a kid, I was a radio fan, which I mean, it was already strange, I think, when I was a kid. I'm sure it's even more strange now. But then you see it kind of come back, I think, with podcasts.
Yeah.
Like in the mid to late 2000s when podcasts first started being big, I was like, this is weird that people are listening to radio again, right?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
and I remember I was working at Radio Shack at the time, and I was like, I think that like eventually internet radio will be like the radio that people listen to, right? and it doesn't necessarily look the way that I thought it would look, right? But it pretty much has happened that people are listening to playlists and listening to podcasts and stuff as they drive around. And so radio kind of comes back that way. So yeah, my interest in Wells goes back to elementary school, I think. Fourth or fifth grade social studies, we had a unit on radio plays, and we listened to the War of the Worlds and talked about the reaction to that. And I just remember being just so fascinated by that, and I wanted to
Yeah.
be a radio personality and all these things. Um, but then as I get older, coming back to kind of Tom's points, cinema classes in college, and we watch Citizen Kane, and we talk about these things, and I go off and study apocalyptic rhetoric and these types of things. So then when we come into the COVID era, and Tom is talking about this, and we're looking at things having to do with nuclear weapons and political
Right.
instability and all this stuff, suddenly the 1940s didn't seem that far away anymore, and a lot of these issues have seemed to come back around again.
Yeah. I know that's so fascinating. And it's really fascinating how radio has kind of come full circle, like you were alluding to, Dr. Cole, of like that's what we do. It just looks a little maybe slightly different than it did a few decades ago, but we haven't necessarily lost the interest of listening to the radio.
Hmm.
Absolutely. So, for listeners who may not be familiar, what were the Orson Welles commentaries? What kinds of issues did Welles take on in these broadcasts, and what made his rhetorical style distinctive?
Yeah, so I mean, these were 15-minute shows that aired on Sunday afternoon on ABC uh, during sort of 1944 through 1946. And so, with it, Wells at this point in time was known primarily for Citizen Kane. He did give a lot of political speeches for FDR before this, but this would have been the first time most Americans had heard Wells's activism in politics, which were very, very left wing, especially at the time when the country was veering more toward the right. And so Wells, throughout these broadcasts, there's about 50 of them, a few more than that. But he goes into topics that were really controversial. Some of them, most notably, being race. In a series of broadcasts, he tries to track down an officer who beat and blinded a Black World War II veteran. Those are the most. That's the most famous of the commentaries. But he also talked about interracial marriage. There were a number of broadcasts about nuclear weapons and his fear that that was going to be something that was more widespread and cause the destruction of the world. There were also broadcasts that talked a lot about what was going on in Europe and America's placement in the post-World War II society, and the fact that like we had to go and help Europe not just rebuild, but also give them, funding to get rid of poverty. And so with it, these were shows that were like deeply political, and as like Andy was saying, they're even relevant today because a lot of the things that he's talking about from politicians not actually dealing with problems in America or looking at the world in like a holistic perspective, or the issue of race in the 1940s, still a problem in the 2020s. And so with it, the broadcasts in for audiences in 1945 would have been just bizarre because you had the guy that was known for Citizen Kane, for War of the Worlds, being a very, very sort of highbrow entertainer. Also, one that was known for trickery is now talking about these issues that are kind of scary and also
Right.
controversial. And so, with it, I think that caused a problem then. But for audiences today, it's hearing these. You could probably put it on, and if you didn't know they were somebody talking in the 1940s, some of them, are equally relevant today. I mean, especially like the talk of nuclear weapons and building up nuclear arms. That's a conversation that we can see going on in America and the world in the 21st century.
And to your point, there was a time, I don't know when it was now, a year and a half ago, where I just put a bunch of these on my phone and I listened to them driving around. And you do kind of get lost in it for a minute where you go, wait a minute, this is 80 years old. Like it really did it has kind of a bizarre, there are some very specific things that are different, right? There's specific acts and politicians and things that he talks about, but some of like the larger concepts and some you just kind of go like, oh yeah, 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 and then and then you come back to it a minute, go, oh yeah, this is news from 80 years ago. It
Wow.
doesn't really, it doesn't seem like it's
Yeah.
necessarily that long ago.
That is fascinating. So you guys describe this project as exploring the relationship between Wells and his US audience. What did that relationship look like in the 1940s, and how did he use radio as a tool to connect, persuade, or even provoke?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that we're turning this into a book length project. And so with it, one thing that we've noticed is Wells uses his voice and uses his persona in a way that, when it comes to podcasts and radio, I think authenticity is a really important thing in the 21st century. What's unique about Wells is his sense of authenticity and being a truth teller in 1945 would have been very suspect, because most
Yeah.
people would have known him for the War of the Worlds podcast, or not podcast, the War of the Worlds broadcasts in 1938. Was a fake news report of an alien invasion. And so with it, here you have Wells talking about issues that are relevant in the news in 1945. And so he also sort of stumbles around with his sense of ethos and persona by talking about the fact that he's an entertainer and what right does he have talking about these issues, but then says, well, it's my right as an American citizen. And so with it, one way that he sort of conceptualizes his audience is, trying to defend his, stance on these issues, but then also he makes an assumption that his audience is always going to be agreeing with him. And so he uses a tactic that we call the spokesman tactic, where he introduces an issue, talks about it, but then makes the assumption, oh, well, of course you agree on this. So, for example, in the broadcasts on Isaac Woodard, the World War II veteran who was beaten and blinded by an officer in South Carolina, he introduces Woodard's story and says, hey, we're outraged that this happened, and like, what are we going to do about it? And so with it, it's this idea that, hey, we're going to solve this issue of racial injustice. The fact that the judicial system hasn't done it, like, together we're going to do that as an audience. And so with it, a lot of these broadcasts are purposefully, I think, provoking the audience to say, hey, like, let's take a stand on it. But the problem is, his ethos there, I think, creates a little bit of a disconnect, and that's kind of what's unique and interesting about them is, perhaps if Wells had these broadcasts later, or if his audience knew him differently, they might have resonated more. But they do take on kind of like a very like intimate, I'm talking directly to you in terms of the audience message. And one of the ways he might have thought about why these broadcasts should be written and performed the way that they were is he was a strong supporter of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who famously used the radio to connect to audiences in the 1930s to tell them about what was going on, in the United States. And so Wells takes on that approach a little bit, but then uses his dramatic flair to once again make them entertaining at the same time as informational.
And thinking of that dramatic flair too, one of the devices he uses essentially is this kind of audience feedback thing that you still obviously have in podcasts today. I think every podcast I've listened to has questions from the listeners and stuff like that. He has these letters that he will read, which I don't know if there's any way we can know for sure, right, Tom? If these letters are real or not, or if they're simply rhetorical devices. Either way, I think it goes to his overall authenticity, right? Because, I mean, one of the interesting things about Wells being a theater guy and a magician and all these things is any sort of like trickery or sleight of hand that he does is going to still be authentically Wells, right?
Right.
So, to a certain extent, letters that he uses that, yeah, some of them seem very convenient that somebody would send this letter because it offers the perfect launching pad for whatever it is he's going to say. We don't know that it wasn't sent, but also, interestingly enough, a lot of times those are things that are like critical of him, right? Like, it's like I'm getting this negative audience feedback that I'm going to share and kind of put into this narrative, but then you all agree with me. I mean, it's really kind of an interesting, because, I mean, to your point, especially with those Woodard broadcasts, it's all the time, we are going to find you, we are going to do this, we are going to, there is that very much going on. But then at the same time, like I said, a lot of those letters that he uses as those jumping off points are all things that he either are critical of him or critical of things that he thinks, like what sending aid to Europe or whatever those things might be.
Right.
And with those letters, I mean, and with the entire broadcast themselves, I mean, he makes himself the center of attention and the focal point. And so with it, whether it's the woman from Weehawken, which is a character, a woman who supposedly wrote him a series of letters, like questioning his viewpoints, questioning his role as a commentator.
Right off the bat, right? Why is
Yeah,
he even on the air?
she appears, I think, in the first broadcast, and then for the next, several, keeps writing him letters. Um, but Wells uses that as the jumping off point for like saying this is why it matters. Like this isn't about me, it's about you. But it is inherently about him because he casts himself as like kind of like an avenger of justice in some of the
Right.
broadcasts, or the voice of peace, or the voice of reason. He uses what we call Manichaean rhetoric, which simplifies the world into right and wrong, and he's always on the side of right or justice, and uh, the opposition is always evil, wrong, the devil. In the Woodard broadcasts, he casts anybody who supports Jim Crow laws or who doesn't want to avenge Woodard as uh, the devil. He talks about, these people burning in hell. Like, it's very, very dramatic rhetoric. And once again, simplifying these issues into, well, it's either right or wrong. And he's always positioning himself as like, hey, if you're with me, you're on the side of the righteous, the
Yeah.
folks that are going to save the country versus those that are on, the negative side, the bad side.
Yeah, that is wildly interesting. I love your guys' depth of knowledge in this, and it's like so fascinating. So, while celebrity seems to have both an asset and constraint in his political communication, how did his fame help him reach audiences, and in what ways did it limit how his political messages were received? So, you guys have kind of alluded to this, but can you expand a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only reason he had the radio show was because Wells became famous on the radio.
Mhm.
ABC would have been like the bottom tier of the radio networks at the time, and so like, hey, we're getting this big name radio celebrity to host a show. Um, they didn't really know what they were getting into because the show was supposed to be like Wells's, platform to do whatever he wants, and which most people probably most of the radio network heads probably thought, oh, he's going to do like dramatic readings, or he's going to, do another War of the Worlds broadcasts, and then all of a sudden,
Right.
right off the bat, it's this very sort of pedantic commentary on, issues that even like some of the stuff that he talks about, they're so specific to like 1945 post World War II society that like you have to do some research to figure out, well, what the heck is he talking about? Um, and so with it, I think one, he did have an audience. People did follow his radio shows. They did see his movies. But at the same time, once again, it was probably the fact that they thought they were going to get entertained, not kind of, spoken to, told this is what is expected of you to solve these problems. And so with it, I think that there, like we were talking about in terms of authenticity, Wells is very much himself in these broadcasts, but I don't think his audience understood that because um, the way that media worked in 1945, you're
Mhm.
only visible through a handful of places, newspapers, the radio, movies, and a lot of it was just sort of a PR machine. Whereas Wells, you know, this was something that movie studios, radio networks probably didn't necessarily want him veering into because it does cover that pretty controversial stuff.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff now, I would think. I mean, if you went on the air right now and said some of the stuff he said, I think people would. And so then you think about it in terms of 80 years ago. But then also at the same time, then he can switch and then one week read like a very nice Christmas story, and none of it seems really out of place. Like all of it again seems just kind of part of this Wells catalog, if you will, that really, like, no matter what he presents is going to seem, at least through my eyes, 80 years later, like even things that seem different like that. Like one week I'm going to talk about politics, and then I'm going to read a Christmas story, and then I'm going to talk about the opening of this play, and all these different type of things. I mean, if you wrote them down on paper, they would seem fairly disjointed, but if you listen to them week to week, it just, kind of like any other podcast episode, right? Like each week has its own little focus and you just kind of go on.
I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that's interesting about these too is that they seem like almost off the cuff, but they're very clearly like deliberately written. And he has a radio sponsor, so obviously he knows I've got 15 minutes. Two of those minutes are going to be, a commercial for the sponsor. And so with it, it does sort of take on kind of the format of a lot of podcasts now, which might seem off the cuff, might seem like unscripted, but at the same time, it very much is. I mean, the only difference with this is it's literally just Wells talking. He doesn't usually ever have guests. The only time that there is one is if he's sick, and there's a few shows where it's somebody else doing these broadcasts. But I mean, it does take on kind of like a non premediated format, even though he clearly did write a script.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in your work, you contrast Wells's rhetorical trajectory with later figures like Reagan, Ventura, and Trump, entertainers who successfully entered politics. What do you think changed culturally or communicatively between Wells's time and theirs?
I
Want to
mean,
take this,
kind
Andy?
of the simple aspect there is, maybe not that much.
I know you
Yeah.
guys have kind of alluded to that as well, which is fascinating.
Certainly the platforms have changed, and I think this aspect of the connection to future entertainers or celebrities turned politicians is, I think, one of the things we've kind of talked about the most and yet maybe made the least grounds with. Because, yes, there is a thing here. I mean, the simple answer is probably just if Wells had his same exact tone and style and approach, but had better reflected the political atmosphere that was turning more conservative at the time, he might have been more successful, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of hedging there because there's no way we could possibly know.
Right.
But certainly that, especially given the names that you just gave, I mean, that seems to be kind of one of the things that would stand out because as Tom said, I mean, he's very avenging, aggressive tone and style for these things. I don't know that that's really the rhetoric of the left, and he would certainly have been the far left then, probably the far left now, wouldn't you say, Tom?
Yeah.
It's not really the style or the tone that they typically adopt, I don't think.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the interesting things is and that we haven't mentioned is in 1945, Wells was seriously thinking of leaving the entertainment world. He was interested in running for Senate in his home state of Wisconsin against Senator Joseph McCarthy. And so with it, these broadcasts were kind of one of the ways that he thought, okay, how can I sort of do a career change, or how can I use my public persona to go from being the entertainer to being a politician? And so prior to this, he gave a bunch of speeches on behalf of FDR. Him and FDR were buddies. He was there when FDR was really sick and basically dying. Um, and so Wells thought, okay, well, at this point in time, he was also having trouble getting his film career to like be the way he wanted it to be. After Citizen Kane, which was his first film, often regarded as really, really important cinematically, a lot of his films were taken away from him, and studios chopped them up, or reshot them, or changed the ending. And so that frustrated him, and so he thought, oh, well, maybe I can do something better. And in fact, in a lot of these broadcasts, he says, well, like, the theater can wait, filmmaking can wait. This is something that is calling me that I should do, which is very, very much like what Reagan said. In terms of when he was thinking about running for governor and then running for president, it was the idea that he was being drawn to this or called to it. You could
Right.
even say the same thing about Trump. Trump obviously known for the Apprentice, the Celebrity Apprentice in the early 2000s, but then we get to, 2008, 2010, and he's increasingly calling into Fox and CNN and anyone who will listen to him and giving his opinion about given issues and always thinking about, entering the field of politics. And so with it, it's that idea of like opinion and celebrity, like they're the jumping off point, and it's just a matter of like, we could say rhetorical timing.
Hmm.
They're like the political scene for somebody like Donald Trump or Reagan or Ventura was prime for somebody that's an outsider, somebody that can shake things up and be a little bit different. At the time that Wells was interested in running for the Senate, in being a political commentator, we're shifting from Harry Truman to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Probably not like a time of being a huge radical. In that regard. And so with it, I think like in terms of celebrity and politics, kind of like what Andy was saying, I think a lot of it boils down to like the political climate itself. I mean, if Wells were giving these broadcasts now, he'd probably be aligned with the Bernie Sanders, the AOC, side of the left, and maybe successful at it. It's hard to know that, but he definitely does have that sort of tone that uh, is very, very sort of black and white, very dramatic. He's kind of like, I don't like to make comparisons, but like a left version of like Donald Trump's rhetoric. It
Yeah.
has a very similar type of like uh, like harsh tone.
Yeah.
The only difference is like they're talking about issues in two different ways. So
I
yeah,
think this is also where the platform or the channel, and that's why I say maybe not a whole lot has changed outside of the platforms or channels, right? Because Wells is at a time where like you are one of the three radio stations, right? And it's hard to find exact ratings and things from that time. We did try, but regardless, there's probably more people that are listening to any given podcast that's very successful than were probably even listening to some of these radio shows even when they were the only games in town, right? So that's, I think, the way that audience and communities around a particular person would change. So if you were somehow able to either take podcasting to the time of Wells or bring Wells to the time of podcasting, he may have gotten a pretty good following for his podcast. You have a famous movie director, you have a person who's well known, he's just constantly shooting off the hip, so to speak, right, with the types of things that he's talking about. There could have been a pretty big community about that. But that's not the atmosphere of radio broadcasting, right? This is going
Yeah.
out to everybody of all political spectrums, of all ages, of everything else. It doesn't have, this target audience demographically that is kind of being chosen and then comments on the YouTube videos and does all these various things at the time. This is just coming into your home via radio and giving pretty, you know, hot takes, I guess, for lack of a better term, on a lot of these issues, including very potentially cataclysmic issues like atomic testing. I mean, one of those early ones talks about they're going to be testing atomic bombs for the first time. What if this destroys the atmosphere and kills all of us instantly? I don't know. I guess we'll find out if we have a show next week. I mean, obviously, I'm kind of paraphrasing and hyperbolic, hopefully in a ways that Wells would appreciate. But, that's kind of the general sense, right? I mean, we can sit back now and be like, okay, yeah, it obviously didn't kill all life on Earth as soon as we had the first atomic test, but that is a weird thing at the time, right? And I think some of
Yeah.
these things are lost to time, right? The very first time this is going to happen is a huge event that you don't know what's really going to happen. And so, having these types of takes coming into your home, everybody's home that has a radio, and whether they're choosing to listen to this or not, is very different than the type of grocery cart picking and choosing what perspectives that you are getting and influenced by that we have with contemporary podcasting.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good segue into my next question. So, radio, like podcasts today, was such an intimate medium. Do you see parallels between the kind of rhetorical relationship Wells built with his audience and what modern creators or communicators are trying to do now?
yeah, and I mean, I think it's interesting to think about audience when it comes to the two mediums because, as Andy
Right.
pointed out, radio in 1945, you've got three main networks, and so with it, Wells his broadcast, his conception of audience is basically like anybody who's going to tune in, like you're tuning the dial, and all of a sudden you stumble across, these broadcasts which are very sort of highbrow, very intellectual, very in the weeds, politically speaking. I mean, it's the type of political commentary you'd expect to see, in a very, very like political podcast. Whereas today, it's rightfully so, as Andy pointed out, like, oh, you can go and like pick and choose what you want to hear, and so you know who your audience is. And so I think Wells, one of the difficulties for him was just always assuming that his audience was in agreement, or his audience
Yeah.
was paying attention to what was going on in post World War II Europe, which is a big, big part of some of his early broadcasts. And so with it, I think in terms of when you think about Wells's audience, it's one that's more of him trying to sort of create this rhetorical audience in a traditional public speaking sense, trying to tie in like values like, oh, well, we're for American patriotism, or we're for fighting poverty, or we're for, fighting injustice. Whereas I think more modern podcasts are all about like knowing your audience, is aligned with these things. And so you can be
Yeah.
a little bit more like, not unserious. You can be a little bit more just sort of, vague, general, casual about these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Agreed. And I think that rhetorical, it's like the rhetorical audience versus the target audience, right? I mean, that's essentially what it is. Yeah, I would agree that Wells has this very, especially the way that Tom and I were kind of raised to teach public speaking, so to speak, through our graduate programs, right? It was very much like a unifying around concepts and values, addressing the audience as something. And certainly Wells does that all the time, as citizens, as Americans, human beings, whatever the case may be. Versus like podcasts today, I mean, a lot of that stuff is not public, maybe available. Presumably, the people that are making the podcast know demographically like who their audiences are. They certainly also get comments and instantaneous feedback across various social platforms that are going to give them at least kind of an idea of who their audience is and how their audience thinks and stuff like that. And they don't need to necessarily appeal to broader concepts or values to have an audience in the same way that you would if you were one of the 3 national networks for something, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a different, and that's why I say again, who knows? I mean, if we transport Wells with a time machine to now and say, here you go, the 1940s Wells to now, and say, here you go, master of all media from the 20th century, what can you do with our modern podcasting? I mean, again, somebody like that could probably find an audience, could probably find a pretty decent sized audience, maybe even bigger than that radio audience was. And maybe that audience would be very receptive to those messaging. But again, we would still maybe end at the same point where is it going to be enough to meet those political aspirations? I don't know.
And Wells had the unfortunate circumstance of he was on one of 3 networks. He also had a sponsor, and so at one point the sponsor drops off the show, and ABC tells him like, "Oh, like we can't pay you anymore," and he says, "Fine, whatever, I'll do it for basically free." And so like that's another sort of thing when thinking about his, these broadcasts, as Wells didn't care what the network and what his sponsor was telling him to do. He said, these are important things. We need people to know about them. And sort of did it, that way. Like I said, in that way, you can better understand, like, he wasn't doing these to make money. It was, like, sheerly an advocacy perspective. And sort of like a ground to see, like, could I get enough support here so that I could run for potentially Senate? Obviously, that never happened. And obviously the show did get canceled, basically a little bit over a year after it started. And so with it, once again, it would be interesting to see what he would have done if he could have literally done anything, because he had a lot of constraints put on him in terms of, what he could say, how he could say it. And one thing that's interesting about his use of the radio medium that we haven't talked about is, even though these are political commentary broadcasts, he does use his storytelling sort of narrative engagement throughout them. So whether he's talking about like nuclear weapons or talking about the issue of, like I said, the Isaac Woodard, the Black World War II veteran who was blinded and beaten in South Carolina, he creates a tale that he's like allowing his audience to sort of engage with, to listen to. And so with it, he's that performative storyteller in injecting the commentary directly in there. And so that makes these broadcasts interesting to listen to, but also when it comes to the authenticity of them, it's like, well, is this just another War of the Worlds? Is it, him telling us this story that never happened? Even though everything that he's talking about did, but if you have that public stigma of this is the guy that faked, an alien invasion in 1938, people might not pay attention as much.
Right. Yeah, totally understandable. So you're both working on to turn this research into a book. What's been the most surprising or challenge what has been most surprising or challenging in translating your scholarly analysis into something for a broader readership?
I think one is just how these things kind of keep reappearing and how they will be most relevant now, right? Like it's one of those weird things where you'd think if you're listening to radio broadcasts from the 1940s, you'd say the hardest part is to say how it's relevant today. Uh, it is only insofar as like what part do you focus on, right? Because like are we going to focus on the medium and that specific aspect, or are we going to focus on the non-medium message aspect, the content that Wells was creating at the time, and then also how to package that in a way, again, because I feel like you could go both ways with this. You could make a completely scholarly treatise on this, but you could also make a very accessible kind of rhetorical history of Wells. You probably wouldn't call it that, but something that could be easily, to a more general readership as well, that would just be interested in things having to do with media history as well. So I think that's certainly one of the hardest parts, is that every time we have another uptick in some sort of political issue, or everything is politicized now, so kind of take your pick there, but just the examples that we always come back to, atomic and nuclear weapons and those types of things. I think that's kind of the piece, because you don't want to make a 1,200 page work on this, even though that would be, I think, very easy
Right.
to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing that since we've been working on this, we've been, been working on it, shopping it around, and we also, one of the reasons for why we realized it's a book is there's so many issues here, so many topics, that it's hard to sort of distill it into like one, paper that's published in a journal. And it's also something that crosses the lines of a lot of different academic disciplines, from,
Totally.
rhetoric to, you could say history, you could say media studies, and so with it, it's
American
hard to find
studies.
Yeah.
it's hard to find the right, academic conversation to enter into when, depending on who's reading it, it's like, oh, well, I want to see more of this type of theory or more of this type of analysis. And so what's most interesting about the broadcasts is, once again, the fact that he was able to do these. I mean, the fact that they even aired is kind of remarkable. But secondarily, it's something that is, Andy and I have pointed out, like, we both admire Wells for his, entertainment persona, the works that he's done, but he also has, a very sort of, people joke about, like, the Orson Welles from the 60s, 70s, 80s, who kind of became a joke, unfortunately, because of just his public actions and things like that. And so this is another way of like going back and figuring out, well, how can we sort of revitalize that image so that he's not like the guy who's, selling fish sticks to Americans, but instead somebody that, was very talented, not just in the entertainment world, but also like he's obviously incredibly intelligent if you listen to these broadcasts, and really kind of knows what he's talking about. It's just a matter of, his audience probably didn't want to hear it. And so the most surprising thing is how easy it's been to sort of shift from, well, let's move this from like an academic conversation to one that's a little bit more broader, that folks, even in a general audience, would be interested in.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I think part of that
absolutely.
evolution too is that media evolution, right? Because I mean, he's there along the ways in various forms. He had the television show in Britain for a while. Actually, again, it's interesting. I just remembered while you were saying that when I was in middle school, we actually watched a video from Orson Welles in the 1980s, or he was the narrator. That was about the predictions of Nostradamus. I don't know if you've ever seen this or if we talked about this before, right? But there is kind of that prophetic sense to him too. I think that you get when you go back and listen to some of these. Yeah, they were very politically fueled, a lot of these things, but I think the fact that we're still talking about a lot of these issues today showed that even if he didn't necessarily connect with that audience, he really did kind of have his finger on the pulse of things that were issues and were going to continue to be issues. So I think that is a very interesting piece. And maybe because of those types of things, I think every time that we've chopped up a piece of it, trying to focus on one very specific thing and sent it somewhere, to me, it always feels like there's a piece missing, right? Like it's hard to chop it down to 20 pages or whatever, and then we
Yeah.
send it off, and it feels like something is missing. And reviewers might say something like, "Oh, this is an interesting case, but something's missing," right? I mean, and I feel like that is kind of the thing that we get into because these are such rich texts. We have a person behind these texts that is just creativity is off the charts, and then we also have this huge corpus of ways to look at him, as you talk about, whether it's through theater, through radio, through cinema, the highest levels of cinema you can achieve, to direct VHS tapes in the 80s and TV commercials and whatever types of things. I mean, there's just so much to look at here and so much to think about in terms of your context for these texts too. That just makes it extremely fascinating, but also I think very hard to just pick off those little tiny pieces that would maybe be of interest to a specific journal or something like that.
Yeah, that absolutely, I can see the challenges there. So a book is incredibly exciting, and it seems as if you'll be able to kind of encapsulate more than you would having to like divvy it up to a bunch of different journals and basically disciplines. 'Cause like you said, it crosses so many disciplines. It kind of feels like the book does it more justice than otherwise than cutting it up, like you were just saying, Dr. Cole. So, yeah, absolutely. So, finally, what do you hope readers and listeners of this conversation will take away about the intersection of celebrity, political rhetoric, and communication's role in shaping democracy?
I think the biggest one is that, right now a lot of the conversation is around like, oh, podcasting has changed the political landscape, or, Trump redefined the idea of like what a celebrity can do with politics, or Reagan did it. When like that goes back well before like even Reagan in the 1960s. Here we have, Wells kind of dipping his toe in the water, but creating this unique persona platform model of like showing, okay, well, you can go from Hollywood to this the realm of politics pretty easily. And I mean, it makes sense for a lot of these figures. And so with it, I think the biggest thing is that one, the history of this goes back well before Reagan. Two, it's also the idea that entertainment and politics have always been, intertwined. Wells is just one example of many celebrities who, go out and do these things. But I think it's also the idea that, like, when it comes to forms of media that are popular at a given point in time, so like now podcasting, as Andy pointed out earlier, like what podcasting is literally going back to radio. And so a lot of times when it comes to media history or thinking about, popular forms of media now, like what's new is probably actually old. The form of the podcast is literally for like earliest form of, popular media in the 20th century. Like they're radio
Right.
broadcasts. The only difference is they're not over the airwaves. They're a little bit more niche. But the same tactics are there. And so I think that, from a media perspective, that's interesting. And also from a political perspective, and political rhetoric, once again, a lot of stuff written right now about, Jon Stewart, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, even Trump, like the idea that you have these hyperbolic voices that are talking about issues in a unique way. That also isn't something that's a 21st or a like post 90s phenomenon. Like Wells was doing that in 1945, and you know doesn't sound that much more heated than some of the biggest voices now. The only difference is you know the contextual scene surrounding it. So I think like having that conversation about you know what things look like in 2025 isn't that much different. It's something that I teach my students is like when we look at like is social media revolutionizing things, is like TikTok the thing that's changing the world? Well, no, like everybody said that about every other medium before this.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of once again letting the world know like, hey, this has always been a thing, and you
Yeah.
know giving that broader history.
Which, in various contexts, I think is something that you and I have been saying in various circles for 15 years to various types of responses, right? Because there's always this kind of, well, yeah, this time is different. And it's like, well, yeah, each time is different and things play out slightly differently, but we have this rich media history that we can look back over the last 150 years. And I don't think that, I mean, if you think about the time of human history and then just the increasing speed and changes in technology over the last 150 years, yeah, that has been unprecedented, obviously, right? But at the same time, the way that these things are used, people have not changed that much in 150 years, right? People have not changed as much as the technology has changed. We don't double in anything having to do about us every 5 to 14 months, right? Like technologies might. Again, I don't know what that doubling would be, that we evolve into some sort of higher consciousness every 5 months or something like that. That's just not a thing, right? So
Right.
then we can look back and say, oh, well, if we can find some of these older texts and things, there's a lot more parallels. I doubt that anybody who's reading ad copy on any contemporary podcast realizes that, like, somebody like Wells was doing the same exact thing on a radio show from 1945 that basically sounds exactly the same, right? I mean, the product is different, but it's the same. It's the same general idea. It's the same thing. It's packaged in the same type of form. The Orson Welles commentaries were like 15 minutes long, 15, 20 minutes long, depending on the length of a podcast. You might have some short form or longer form, right?
Right.
But I mean, it's just it, without getting too deep into the history aspect of it. I think that a lot of times we don't think about these changes and what these changes actually mean. Do they change things? Yes, but and I'm obviously not the first to say this, right? But like, will it change things in the short term? Possibly. Will it change things in a way everybody thinks it will? Maybe not. And the example that I always use for my own research and stuff like that is computer labs, right? In the 1980s, and computers are filling classrooms, and everybody's saying that computers are going to change everything about education, and why do we even need a teacher anymore, because we've got computers in the classrooms and we can all do Harvard modules or whatever, and we're going to do this. And now you fast forward 40 years and they're taking computers out of classrooms and people aren't having computer labs anymore. It's not because computers didn't change education, but now in the 1980s, they weren't thinking that you would have a laptop computer in front of you, a phone computer in your hand, and a watch computer on your wrist, right? That wasn't something that they saw at the time. And I feel like we can take that logic and think about it in a lot of media ways, right?
Yeah.
If you give Wells Twitter, is he going to use it any differently than any contemporary celebrity, especially one with political aspirations?
No.
I would guess you would use it exactly the same. I mean, we'll never know. It's speculation, right? But
Right.
I feel like there's a lot more similarities than differences probably over time with a lot of these things.
Yeah, just incredibly fascinating. And I just want to thank you both for taking the time to talk with me today about your fascinating work. You guys pose so many important questions about really what's changed and kind of the realization that probably not much has changed that is so applicable and relevant to our discipline as well as so many disciplines. So yes, thank you guys so much for being here today. I really appreciate it and I really enjoyed learning about your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our conversation with Dr. Andrew Cole and Dr. Thomas Salek. What stands out to me is how much of what we are experiencing today, the blending of entertainment, media, and politics, isn't entirely new. But the way those relationships are received, amplified, and acted upon has shifted in meaningful ways. Looking back at Orson Welles reminds us that communication isn't just about message, it's about medium, audience, and the broader cultural moment. And perhaps more importantly, it challenges us to think critically about how public voices gain influence and what that means for democratic engagement. As always, thank you for listening to Cultivate Talk. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show and share it with someone interested in media, rhetoric, or the evolving relationship between communication and politics. Until then, keep cultivating conversations that matter.